Thank you. I invite you to have a seat.
Okay, thanks. Fascinating conversation. What I want to try to do in about 35 minutes is suggest to you two dimensions of the context in which the question of open content arises. As a matter of a historical trajectory of what's at stake. What are the basic economics underlying the possibilities and the sustainability of these models, rather than going into the micro details of what are the sustainability models, and spend about half the time talking about why, in the sense of how the emerging modalities of production of information, knowledge, and culture map onto core liberal, democratic, broadly speaking, commitments to autonomy, democracy, and justice. So this is a very boiled down version of a 500-page book that will come out in a couple of months and will be available under Creative Commons non-commercial attribution. And I'm working with a designer co-op in the city in New York to put it within a platform that will actually make it a usable teaching tool with annotation, with some annotation capabilities and note-taking capabilities. But I'm still waving my arms on that rather than able to actually show you anything that's working. But hopefully it'll all be up and running on March 20th. So, I want to talk about the wealth of networks, how social production transforms markets and freedom, and start by talking about the second quarter of the 19th century. Between 1835 and 1850, the cost of starting what was understood in each of these years as a mass circulation daily rose from the equivalent of $10,000 in 2005 dollars to the equivalent of $2.5 million in 2005 dollars. Combination of the cost of capital, electric presses, automatic folding, rotary press on one hand, and on the other, given the high capital cost of production and the higher potential market, the cost of professionalization of the production of information. A lot of things that we now know, like the 6 o'clock news titillation with this murder or that, we begin to see with these daily papers in New York in the 1840s. Now, the critical thing about the move from $10,000 to $2.5 million is the question of whether or not you need a business model and how broad a range of social arrangements are amenable to information production in one or the other. And this ends up being the critical defining characteristic of media to reach the ever-expanding relevant social community for the next 150 years. Broadcast, television, satellites, mainframes follow the same model. Now, what we see in the industrial information economy is a stark bifurcation between producers and consumers, with passive large audiences, professional, mostly but not only commercial producers, market-based or government-owned, largely characterized and anchored the entire period of 150 years, which, for the second part of the presentation here, this is important, which is to say the entire period over which democracies came to become the dominant mode of governance, beating first monarchies and then fascist and communist dictatorships. So our primary intuitive experience with life in democratic societies is in the presence of mass media, built around a particular capital structure that is now changing. So here's an image of what's changing. In June 2002, there was a great shakeup in the American psyche of at least some Americans, when for the first time a Japanese firm, NEC, produced a supercomputer that dwarfed the fastest American supercomputers in the world. 2 years later, a collective sigh of relief as we regain our strength and length, and we become an IBM just edges out NEC. All this time, SETI at Home, a distributed computing project involving some 4.5 million contributors using their leftover computer cycles while they're not using their computers, dwarfs all of these other efforts. Now, it's true that today there are two versions of Gene Blue that actually are faster than SETI at Home was running yesterday or the day before. But the basic point to capture is that what we're seeing is radical decentralization of the capital components of communication and computation. Computation, storage, and communications capacity. All three are radically distributed in the economy. Every connected person, depending on who you ask, somewhere between 600 million and 1 billion people on the planet, has the physical capital necessary to make and communicate information, knowledge, and culture. This puts us in a very new and unfamiliar setting, where the most important inputs into the core economic activities of the most advanced economies are widely distributed in the population. That is to say, computation and communications resources, and human creativity, intuition, experience, and motivation. First time that they're widely distributed in the population. And the thing about the human characteristics is that they're non-fungible, they're individual, they're unique. Any one of you who has left one job and transferred to another and had to write up a memo so that the person after you knows what to do can imagine what it means that you can't quite make them as effective as you were the day before and just transfer everything you learned in the 5 years you did this on a piece of paper. Now, what does this mean? It means that human beings can now do what they've been doing for a very long time, but not on the peripheries of the economy, but at its very central. So, if what we have is, hi, how are you? Let's talk. Or, have you heard the one about so-and-so? Or, excuse me, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? Normal social interactions that were always set on the peripheries of the economy now come to the central. And what we begin to see is the emergence of commons-based production. Production that's based on utilization of inputs from a resource set in which no one exerts exclusive rights. And here, whether it's legal or illegal doesn't matter. Right? What matters is the social practice, the extent to which, so for example, the question of do you or don't you give access one way or another. There's the formal answer, and then there's the world we live in. And the world we live in is not perfectly free, but it's constrained differently from the world of rights. And the commons, in my definition, is that set of practices that we understand ourselves to be free to do, given the practicalities of enforcement. Appropriating the outputs without asserting exclusive property rights in them. And this can be individual or collective. It can be commercial or non-commercial. So, for example, if you Google Viking ships, the top site will be a site that's quite a good one, collects all sorts of materials. It's produced by a 5th grade teacher in Gander, Newfoundland. And it's the #1 on Google on Viking ships. And as I've been showing this over the past 4 or 5 years, he moved from having it on some private site to something that's actually formally part of the Canadian Ministry of Education in some form or another, but it continues to be the same guy doing the same thing alone, individually. The other phenomenon that we're seeing that is a subset of commons-based production is peer production and sharing. Peer production, various sized collections of individuals who effectively produce information goods, and the critical point is without price signals or managerial commands, and we'll talk about what those are. And I'll just mention briefly sharing of material resources like SETI at Home, large-scale practices of effective sharing. Components are material resources, including private economic goods, and that's what makes it different from information production. And the outputs are not necessarily public goods like information. They may be rival, like broadband access over wireless, which still doesn't mean they're scarce or that you're not better off sharing than selling, but they're not non-rival. What we're seeing in all of these, as I'll say as an overview and then go into some detail, is the emergence of a solution space to problems of production that depends on sharing, social exchange, social relations, instead of either price signals in the market or managerial commands either in firms or through bureaucracies. So the thing that everybody, and of course Richard Stallman was here yesterday, so I don't need to talk about this too much, but the thing that captures attention to begin with all of the skeptics, is this image. Right? In 1996, two groups of people figured out that web browsers were a big thing, and one needed to develop a server that would respond to them. 10 years later, one of these groups has 20% of the market, the other 70% of the market. One of these groups was Microsoft, understanding this to be absolutely critical to its future, at the time at least. The other was a bunch of volunteers who sort of said, well, we need such a thing, let's put together something and it'll work. Now, if I told you that after 10 years, this bunch of volunteers succeeded in still maintaining 20% of the market, including mission-critical servers like Amazon's secure transaction, you'd say, that's amazing. But of course, the answer is the opposite. Apache is the 70%. Microsoft is the 20%. So that's a fact. And all the claims about it not being sustainable, not being economically rational, have to respond to facts in the world like this one. But I don't want to talk today about software. I want to talk about content. So one of the things we see with collaborative production is the ability to reorganize the production activity so as to capture large-scale collective sharing. So there was a period, and the nice thing about this, it's easy to understand and it's well studied because it was only a study by NASA as opposed to a long-standing ongoing project. They took images from Mars that they used to have fully paid PhDs mapping onto maps. And they put them out in these small boxes, and they said, mark craters. And then they wanted to see, will we get good maps? And after 6 months, they studied. 85,000 people had contributed. They were mapping Mars images faster than they were getting them by the transmissions, and the results were, quote from the study, practically indistinguishable from those of a fully trained PhD. When you get 5 to 20 people looking at a 2-inch by 2-inch square and showing the sides, it turns out you can compute an average that's as good as you can get. But that's rather simple. The other thing that now everybody knows about is Wikipedia. So this is an entry in Microsoft's Encarta about Barbie, a typical Barbie. On the other hand, we have Wikipedia. This is it. This is the entire definition. It's a sub-definition of doll more generally. On the other hand, in Wikipedia, we have a fairly substantial definition. This is just a table of contents. We have a discussion of the critique of Barbie and the support of Barbie. But the basic point is that what we have is an encyclopedia in which something on the order of 60,000 people are participating in an immensely open environment. Now, in the last month, we've had two things that have put Wikipedia in the news. One was an anecdote, the other was data. The anecdote was the mistaken biography that was offensive and problematic. The data was the Nature study that actually sent 43 definitions to scientists and compared Britannica to Wikipedia, which is better, and they said, they both have so many errors, but in roughly equal measure. So this is the gold standard of encyclopedias in this most open of internet services. By the way, the Columbia Encyclopedia, encyclopedia.com, has Barbie Klaus. Now, if we're interested in relevance, Yahoo invented the idea of a human-edited directory. Unlike Alta Vista, unlike Lycos, those things of the mid-90s, we have human beings look at these things and tell you what's good. And this is what they have for online journals. On the other hand, the Open Directory Project, on the order of 50,000 volunteers, each one looking at their own category and what they care about, produce and systematically update to the point where, certainly in this field, Yahoo doesn't seem to have updated in the past 5 years. This is an image that I keep updating just to make sure, but if you actually look at the graphics of how Mozilla was looking at the time, this is not new. But it's still the same now. Google is peer production of relevance integrated into a business model. Because the critical decision that Google makes, which is what's relevant to you, is farmed out to the distributed decisions of millions of people around the net who produce web pages and say, I think this is relevant. So the critical move by Google is to take relevance ranking and generate it by taking a picture of a collective judgment out there. On the other hand, we had Overture, which was a market-based system where you were ranked based on how much money you paid Overture. And we know between Google and Overture which of these two you have likely used in the last 24 hours. Now let me talk about stuff, things. And things have a different economy, and since we're talking content here, I won't spend a lot of time, but I think it's important to recognize that a parallel thing is happening in physical things. Imagine that in 1998, a congressman wanted this built by the government, or an executive wanted this built by a company. I want a data storage and retrieval that stores terabytes, is available 24/7 from anywhere in the world, can support 100 million users, is robust to any kind of attack, including closure of the main index server, injection of malicious files, armed seizure of various given sets of storage places. You'd say that'll take a decade. It'll cost millions. But of course, that's peer-to-peer file sharing. Right? Ignore for a moment the noise about the copyright issue, that is to say what the data is, and just understand it as an enormously efficient and robust data storage system that's built by people sharing the storage they can afford to share because they're not using it for something else. Distributed computing, we've already mentioned with mesh networks, with SETI at home. In wireless, in bandwidth, we're seeing the same thing with the development of mesh networks. We're seeing it now very sporadically over 802.11 with Wi-Fi, when you just sort of hang out and open your laptop and someone still hasn't turned on their encryption, and you can use their bandwidth when you need it. But we're seeing certainly a set of possibilities of development of wireless networks based on mesh architectures, where instead of having the major remaining bottleneck be the lack of a local loop that's competitive, users can use the machine they already have for capacity they already bought for purposes of just roaming around their house, building their own last mile. And we have mix and match. If you think of Skype, Skype combines storage, computation, and transport, sharing it among users to create a voice over IP network, right? This is the Kazaa architecture with a voice codec, creating a global communication system with no infrastructure other than what we bring. Remember, radically distributed capitalization. We bring our own telco piece, we connect to the Skype network, and we can talk all over the world, at least for the people inside the network. Mixing and matching this idea of sharing leftover computation, communication, and storage resources to combine into a new good. So essentially what we're seeing here is that there were 3 transactional frameworks that we were used to having in an era with concentrated capitalization. We had 2 market-based systems. One was decentralized, the price system. The other was centralized, firms. And we had centralized non-market systems that were economically effective, governments and nonprofits, each of which had a business model, if you will, for raising the funds necessary to fund the high capital cost goods necessary to produce information, knowledge, and culture. What we have now with decentralization of capitalization is the emergence of social sharing and exchange, not because we didn't always share socially, but because the capital constraints didn't allow these practices to become central to the economy. And now they are. So, social sharing and exchange as a modality of economic production consists of decentralized authority and practical capacity to contribute to effective action. Instead of being built on the property model of may I create, I can. Physically, and this is the battle that we've been talking about, legally, certainly socially. Reliance on social information flows. What are interesting problems? Who's available? Who's good for this? What counts as good? And on organizational approaches, like Wikipedia, like Slashdot, like a variety of free and open source software development projects, and social motivation structures. Money isn't always the best motivator. We had the conversation just before the break about why people do things. Certainly not for the money was your statement there at the back. We have diverse motivations that can now become effective. The result, the first thing that people see is new competition. P2P networks competing with the recording industry, free and open source software with Microsoft. Wikipedia may not put Britannica out of business, but why someone would pay $60 a year for a subscription to Encarta or to one of the Grolier products? So as to get something, instead of getting for free something that experts say is just as good as Britannica, is a query. Skype competing with telecoms, mesh networks with mobile telephone providers. But not only new competition, but also new opportunities. In devices, from well-behaved appliances like TVs and CD players to production tools like PCs and handhelds and wireless. From markets that are strictly bifurcated into consumer and infrastructure goods to mixed machines. Soft infrastructure like Wi-Fi and Skype, but also mixed machines that have new kinds of demand. And what's probably most important for this crowd, from finished information and cultural goods to platform for self-expression and collaboration. GarageBand now stands both for the software that allows you to mix, but also for the website that now is allowing bands to distribute their information, their music online and actually get exposure. Craigslist, Technorati. We also are seeing surfers. So if the traditional model was you have a deterministic property and contract from a supplier to a firm, from a firm to a customer, I know who to sue, what we get now is this very curious phenomenon of stuff will flow out of connected human beings, and therefore I can contract with someone and say stuff will flow and I will provide a service. Not only that, I will invest in this stuff will flow because stuff will come out. This sounds crazy. But this is what the revenue structure of IBM is with regard to its software services versus patent royalty streams from Linux-related services. So the green is patent royalty streams, and the blue is Linux-related services, topping $2 billion in 2003, and I just don't have newer data, but it hasn't changed much. So, at the end of this, I want to say, social production is a real fact, not a fad. It's the critical long-term shift caused by the internet. In some contexts, it's more efficient than markets or firms. It is certainly sustainable, and it's growing fast, but it is a threat to, and therefore is threatened by, incumbent business models. Intellectual property, telecommunications, all sorts of other new funky laws are the battlefield over the institutional ecology of the digital environment, are the battlefield over whether the state will make these practices easier or harder to practice. Will you be able to cut and paste or won't you? Will it be legal or illegal? Will Howard be able to get the materials he needs from Columbia so that he can create his materials for his class? Oh, I know, you were just a part of the research project. Or will he not? That's the question, how hard or easy it is for these practices to develop, because as capital is no longer the effective constraint on the ability to create, existing information, knowledge, and culture as an input into new creation becomes the new entry barrier. And the height of the entry barrier is fixed by these laws. So now, let's talk about why care. Why do we need an open information environment? What is it that is the effect of open content flowing in a cultural and social environment on which others can build from the perspective of politics. And I will talk about autonomy, democracy, and justice and development. Very briefly, needless to say. Autonomy. The critical shift here is the shift from consumers to users. We see greater individual autonomy to do more for and by ourselves, both alone and in loose association with others. The looseness of this association is important because there were always things we needed other people to do, but usually it required long-term ties, employment, family, neighborhood, which in turn limited the range of things we could do that required association with others, because there's only so many of us. The fact that we're having these kinds of peer production enterprises arise, so that in loose affiliation, because I want to do this for 10 minutes, and I want to do that for 2 hours. And each of these is a projection of my life story that I want to do, but neither can I do by myself. Now I can do both and still go to work on yet a third thing. So again, let's remember, right? Imagine you're a 5th grade teacher in Gander, Newfoundland, and you want to develop a textbook on Viking ships. Just think of the cost of finding the materials, scanning them, compiling them, and then distributing them to your students, much less to the world. So there's a new opportunity set of things we can imagine ourselves as doing by ourselves, for ourselves and for others. In the market, things that are changing. There was just a story in the Times a few weeks ago in the New York Times about Madison, Wisconsin, and the fact that the realtors were scratching their heads because a website was allowing homeowners to just post their stuff online. So suddenly autonomy from the structures of the market that are incumbent. These are all market activities, but under what terms? And finally, speaking of Michael Hart, if you want to develop a Gutenberg project, it's very hard to do by yourself. But if you build a platform, and in the 1 billion people online, you find some portion of bibliophiles who will play with you, you can. This is a new domain of action. Democracy. As I started, our experience is purely with mass-mediated public sphere, right? There's the early American Republic, there's the Dutch Republic, there's some about 18 months worth of French Republic, and the British parliamentary early system, when there was actually decentralized, uncontrolled press. But most of the time where democracies arose, we've had mass media. We'll begin to learn what it means to have social production of the networked public sphere. So here are 2 stories. The first is, before the last election, you may remember, Sinclair Broadcasting declared that it was going to air Stolen Honor, which was roughly a Swift Boat veterans equivalent attack on Kerry, as a documentary. The Kerry campaigns and Democratic National Committee shouted. They said, we're going to go to the FCC, we're going to go to the Federal Election Commissions. They did, and nothing happened. On the other hand, the morning after the report was exposed in the LA Times, there started to be conversation in the blogosphere. The Daily Cause, MyDD, lots of other small ones, Josh Marshall on Talking Points memo, started talking about, what do we do about this? First of all, it's an outrage. Then, now that it's an outrage, what do we do? Let's boycott the stations. Let's picket the stations. Let's object to what they're doing next time they get a license renewal. Let's sign a petition. 36 hours to 48 hours after the whole thing starts, one person who hadn't had a presence on the net of any significance before starts boycott SPG. Josh Marshall links to him. Within a week, they coalesce around, let's boycott local advertisers for the local stations, because they figured out that might work. So let's take another look at this story mapped onto the stock price of Sinclair Broadcasting in the relevant 10 days. The first report, you see the Democratic establishment vows action. There's not much action going on. But all of this time, people are saying, oh, I just put together a database of 800 advertisers. And somebody else says, I just wrote a script that you can send your email to all 800 advertisers. And somebody says, but the advertisers are arguing. So somebody else said, are there any lawyers willing to help? No need for more lawyers after 2 hours. We've got 5 who will help. On Friday, Lehman Brothers comes out with a stock report that says, we're a little worried about people pulling advertising. Monday, the stock goes the way it looks. Tuesday, they say, stolen honor? What documentary? What did you mean, the documentary? We never intended documentary. There was a little commentary on the side, and it goes back up. By the way, that little bump is the day after the election. So, power of the media and power of individuals and the relative power of radically distributed production of political organization. Now let's look at the great moment of American journalism as the fourth estate. This is the classic model, right? Ellsberg goes to the New York Times funds people to sit in a room, pore over the stuff, digest it, find the really important stuff, publish it, then there's a U.S. injunction. The Times say, okay, the Post, you do it, the U.S. injunction moves further, and then the U.S. Supreme Court comes and saves democracy for us, and this is how it's supposed to work. Now, this is a strong argument in favor of powerful media, that it's scary to issue an injunction against, that can run to the Supreme Court, that can hire Floyd Abrams. These are not cheap things to do. So how does it happen online? Let's look at this story. Diebold is a company that makes voting machines. And as you may remember, in 2000, there was something of an issue with the quality of voting in the United States. So 2002 was the first effort at actually creating a mechanical, computer-based voting systems in Georgia. Nothing in the mainstream press. 2, 3, 4 stories basically going, oh, there were some people crabbing about it, but we're assured by so-and-so that it's fine, and such told us that they're sending technicians. And so-and-so is, of course, the official who bought the machines, and such is the company that sold them. One activist, Bev Harris, stumbles across, let's call it, the source code from an FTP site. Now, what's interesting is the ecology that emerges around this. The first thing she does is she puts it on her own site, blackboxvoting.org, and says, come review this. Then she also tells the story in Scoop in New Zealand, which goes back to the question of how much you can do in one country. And they call, there's a call to arms. Now, there's a couple of things in this notice that are critical to how the network public sphere is different. The first is, here, see for yourself. Here are the materials. It's not, we will digest them for you. The practice is now, if you're doing something, show the materials. Now, it's a practice that's seeped back into the mainstream media. Read the report. Here's the 500-page report. We'll write you the 2 pages, but you can access it. See for yourself. The second one is, we think there will be a threat of shutdown. Go distribute them, not go bring the court to help you with your First Amendment claim. Just distribute them, copy them, so they can't be shut down. Some of these files are encrypted, but here are these helpful folks from lostpassword.com, and they could help you with that. Some of these, when you try to decrypt them, will have problems, but here are these nice people at ziprepair.com who will give you this free utility to do that. And finally, what do? Go out there. We don't know what's there, but it looks really important. Good hunting. This is really important. And in fact, one of the hunters, Avi Rubin from Johns Hopkins, actually finds the problems. There's a lot of debate over it. Maryland requires an additional 2 studies, and Diebold is forced to change to some extent. In the meantime, Bev Harris becomes a sufficiently important person in this story that when an anonymous whistleblower gets a cache of emails, they send it to Wired, mainstream media, that tells a story that goes roughly, can you believe these people? They lost their code again? And that's it. And sends it to Bev Harris, who says, emails, good hunting, we know what to do with this. However, at this point, Diebold says, no. These emails belong to us. They're copyrighted. So they don't write to her. They write to her ISP and say, under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, you have to take off these copyrighted materials, or else you'll be liable. So the emails, in fact, get off. However, a number of the kids who read it are Swarthmore students. And they made copies on their servers. So they're still copies. But Diebold knows what to do about this, right? So, Swarthmore, DMCA, we will sue you unless you take it down. End of story. Right? Wrong. Wrong because there is an entire ecology at this point that replicates and analyzes what's going on. Individual users at other campuses. And here's what's interesting is the intersections between both the legal and the illegal communities, the commercial and the non-commercial. The emails are injected into Freenet, which is a free software developed platform intended to be censorship resistant, but also into Overnet, which is a commercially developed project for making money from illegal file sharing, which also has free software readers in case eDonkey ever goes under because of litigation. There continue to be free software clients that you just can't sue out of existence because there's no one to sue. So what we see is a major ecology combining legal and illegal, mainstream and fringe, creating a context that is a completely new way of resisting the suppression of information. The efficacy, in fact, these emails make it into the California State Commission's review of the Diebold machines. A large number of them, not all of them, but a large number of them are decertified. And in the meantime, the students go to a court and say, declaratory judgment, copyright law can't mean that. And in fact, they win. And they get a declaratory judgment that says, Diebold, you're so wrong, you even have to pay their costs. The only problem is this happens 1 year later, long after it was relevant. So yes, their rights were vindicated. But the only reason that the election system was vindicated was because of this mixture of illegality and legality of radically distributed production of the network public sphere. So that's about the public sphere, the political public sphere. We are also seeing the emergence of a critical culture, which is one step removed from what we understand to be politics, but is nonetheless central to how we understand the world. And here I just want to mention two things, two aspects of it. One has to do more with digital technology than with the networked environment, and that's the plasticity and malleability. So we see anime movie videos, we see parodies, we see remix culture as a new way of interacting with culture, not as a passive recipient and you can kibitz about it with your friends, but as something that you use, that you write to, rather than only read from. The other thing is transparency. And transparency means you can actually see how the thing is done. You can participate. By participating, you become a better reader. By being able to break it into pieces, you understand what the components are. You're able to query them and question them. And so again, if we go back to this, if you participate in actually what goes into Barbie, you can actually begin to develop nuances about, yes, Barbie construes girls as one model, but also Barbie is the first doll of a professional woman in all sorts of professional woman clothes, not only cuddly doll, etc. Conversation. It's not this. And more than conversation, you actually have engagement through the talk facility of talking about what it is that we're saying. Do we agree or don't we agree about this definition? What counts as encyclopedic and common, and what counts as opinion? A completely different relationship to culture. The last thing I want to talk about is justice and development, particularly in the context of global development. And I want to say relatively little, but condense, unlike the rest, which was relaxed, about this. If we look at the components of what we today measure in the Human Development Index as the measure of the basic components of human development, health or life expectancy, education and literacy, and GDP per capita or growth, each and every one of these components is critically dependent on information, knowledge, and culture, on information-embedded goods like pharmaceuticals, like sophisticated seeds, on information-embedded tools like software that allow us to do things better. And in each of these areas, the questions of what sort of access we have to information is critical to the ways in which we can achieve improvements in human development that depend on all of these components. Be it research into food security or medicines, be it research journals, be it access to outcomes data in order to have public health analysis as well as public health education, be it books and teaching materials, computation and communications resources, libraries and academic centers with their dependence on journals for purposes of education, or be it generally the central role of innovation in growth when you're talking about many countries that are net importers of the state of knowledge today, so that if they are to come to the global information economy as at least potentially equal participants, they need access to the state of the knowledge at its marginal cost, which is zero, to be able to compete on equal terms. So the basic point is that more of what makes human welfare and development depends on information, knowledge, and culture. And social and peer production is beginning. And one shouldn't overstate this. I think that with the public sphere, it's more clear that things intrinsically are changing. This is a context in which there's potential. There's also huge need. And I can't tell you here it'll all get better. But there's improvement. Can begin to help with the information side. So we see with free and open source software, let's just take for a middle-income country like Brazil. If you have tens of thousands of free software developers, and if there is a services market that in the United States is on the order of $200 billion a year for software services, that is now open to Brazilian engineers, at least those who can do free software, on equal terms. You don't need a license from the owner in order to compete on these software services. Then you have much better access to global markets, as well as being able to use the software internally. Open academic publishing that allows us better access to the state of the knowledge. Efforts as developing open source by agricultural innovation, like the BIOS initiative. Open bioinformatics, like the HapMap project, like the Human Genome Project, that are increasingly those aspects of biomedical research that are based on computation and information processing are increasingly moving to an open model. And the holy grail of all, open source, well, not more of a holy grail, I suppose, than development of food, but perhaps even harder of actual biomedical innovation all the way to the drugs. I won't talk about all of these. I'll just map out what is the component, how one would think about it. If we just look at scientific publication, the traditional model is government, universities, and commercial players or professional associations in a tightly linked triangle where promotion and tenure depends on publication, and publication and promotion and tenure depend on grant funding, and grant funding depends on publication background, which then goes into the library to buy these very expensive journals, and it's a closed system. What we're beginning to see now is the emergence of individuals on the bottom left-hand corner, non-commercial organizations, and non-IP-based commercial organizations like Biomed Central, developing a new ecology that allows for academic publication to stay open. So we're seeing things like the Public Library of Science, like ArXiv, like the Budapest Open Access Initiative, like Oyster, the Open Access Initiative effort to tag and allow self-archiving to become really accessible. We're seeing a lot more working papers and web-based self-publishing, huge diversity in different fields. In physics, this is much bigger than in biomedical sciences. But the basic model that I want to show here, and that ends up being mapped on each of these other sectors, is that there are systematically similar players. Governments, universities, and individuals, IP-based players, be they Elsevier in publishing, be they pharma in medical innovation, be they Monsanto in seed, non-IP-based businesses, which are actually on the same side as the commons-based producers because they don't depend on IP, like in this case Biomed Central, which has an author-pay model, as well as non-profits that are dedicated to this system, that are more organized than the individuals. In software, for example, we see funding from the government, we see research and design universities, we see the free software developers themselves, but we also see free software getting organized in more traditional models like the Free Software Foundation or Apache foundations. We see software publishing is about 1/3 of all revenues from software. And we see, remember the image of IBM, we see non-IP-based software services playing a huge role in supporting the commons-based production system. And as we move from one of these areas to the other, the question is always, what is the state of this industry? How much is it based on the basic fundamental economics, and how much is it just a path of people being able to create models for rent extraction? And how can we restructure it to create alliances among the non-IP based players so that the information is generated, but is generated and then is freely available for use everywhere? So as I was mentioning, biological innovation for an open society in Australia puts together the BioForge on the model of SourceForge to try to develop research tools for agricultural innovation. And a story that's at the moment more evocative than actually having an effect, Will Scott from Indiana University, Purdue University, decided one of the things we need to do is synthesize chemicals on the way to developing drugs. Well, we have all of these bachelor degree chemistry classes synthesizing stuff and then throwing it in the garbage. Why don't I create a standard set of kits that will go out to 10 or 20 participating institutions where when they're doing what they need to learn to do anyway, they might as well be synthesizing something that on this collaborative computational biology model is said, this might be an interesting something to try. Beginning to think again, I don't know if this is the right answer, but it's the right solution space. Finally, we are, and people have talked about this a lot, so I will only mention it. We're in the middle of a battle over the institutional ecology. It's part of broadband policy and the extent to which the ownership of the pipes is going to allow constriction of who can use it and who cannot, and how much you need to pay, if at all, to be a producer as opposed to simply a consumer. We see the development of devices, a critical legal battle. More important perhaps than any was the one that Howard had mentioned earlier. If, in fact, something like the Hollings Bill, Sibidipita, the Induce Act that's been introduced on a number of occasions, passes, so that the manufacturers of chips will have to sit down with Hollywood and build to their specifications trusted systems in the hardware, then we've moved from decentralized capitalization of production tools to decentralized ownership of glorified televisions. And that is the critical strategic intervention that needs to be stopped. We see software and standards policy. We see the software patents going in one direction, but we also are seeing very strong development of free and open source software, awareness of non-IP businesses, and here we have real competition, not on the legal side so much as on the business side. But then we have acts like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the Net Act, copyright liability for developing utilities, databases. Again, though, competing against successful internet-based innovation and sharing practices, some of which are legal, some of which are illegal. We see regulation of information production, a long litany. All of the toggles that the law was able to flip in the past 7 years have been flipped in favor of the business model that says, I made it, you'll pay me. Raising the costs of participation. And yet, at the same time, we've seen the development of a culture where Creative Commons begins to come in, where free and open source software is understood as important, where much more sharing occurs as something that people are self-conscious about its importance. And the global disdain for copyright, which actually plays an important role, both politically and practically, as we saw in some of these stories. So to wrap up, technological threshold conditions enable greater individual human agency. This creates an expanded domain of effective action for diverse motivations. Social sharing and exchange are therefore emerging as a major modality of economic production, which requires us a new toolkit to understand what is going on, what are the dynamics, how do we construct models, so much of what's going on here in these 2 days. It creates new business challenges and new opportunities, but it also, and this needs to drive it, is creating new ways of being free and equal human beings, a possibility that is subject to a global and persistent political, regulatory, and social cultural battle. Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering if you had seen or could make a comparison between some of the hidden subsidies that go into the free and open source type projects, like the developers who are employed in corporate settings and release things into Linux, with the hidden subsidies that go towards kind of the strong IP regimes that might range from government support for certain kinds of laws to other issues. But could you compare some of the hidden subsidies that each of those two worlds gets?
It's very interesting. In order, by the way, to treat work that someone does on the weekend or in the evening as a hidden subsidy, you have to assume that by paying someone a salary, you own their entire creativity, no matter when and where. Because it's not a subsidy. Is it a subsidy to TV that I create their time so that they can sit and watch TV? Is it correct to think of an employer as subsidizing the producer of a consumer manufactured good that I bought because I saw an ad on TV? Well, if that's the case, then everything is subsidy. And if it's not the case, then to think that what I do with my brain, assuming that I fulfill my obligations to you. Now, there's a real question of the extent to which people shirk and play at what's interesting as opposed to what their employer wants. So I'd like to resist the notion that because people keep body and soul together while working in this place, and then they work for the soul by doing something else elsewhere, it's a subsidy from the formal employment place to the social framework. That's my primary resistance, is the notion that it's subsidy. Now, is it subsidy for the government to create intellectual property, strong copyrights for someone? It's an opportunity for rent extraction. It's a form of monopoly. It's clearly a form of, I wouldn't so much think of it as a subsidy as I would think of it as a form of regulatory capture, a form of inefficient regulation in favor of a certain incumbent that's able to capture. That's absolutely central here.
I mean, as someone who aspires to produce open content, I'm looking for subsidy. So I wasn't entirely honest with my question.
I'm sorry. With regard to looking for subsidy, that's precisely the point. As I was mapping the different industries, the fact that government and non-IP businesses are major sources of money, as well as foundations and non-profit sources. These are all components that work in the traditional economy and therefore have sources of money, but now can be much more effective and leveraged much more effectively using these systems. So the trick, in a sense, is to try and go and explain to existing bodies with flows of money why it is that they could become more effective in this model. And so, for example, in my conversations with Yale Press about whether or not to release my book under Creative Commons non-commercial attribution on the first day, their concern is, what's our long-term trajectory? And so part of the notion of trying to build this up as an educational platform with utilities, with something that actually makes it more useful for teachers and students, is, from their perspective, an experiment into how they could make what they produce more valuable and therefore justify themselves either subscriptions from universities or foundation, or some combination of foundation funding, subscriptions, and purchases of actual copies.
I wanted to ask, could you put your last slide up a second? Just
this one?
Yeah, the social, cultural, and I would want it to suggest potentially political battle, because the struggle
political is first thing. Political, regulatory, social, cultural.
It's politicals first. I'm sorry, a person's head was no, I couldn't see it. To some extent, it's almost like a shadow drama for the political struggle, the struggle over information and access and production. And I was wondering whether or not you saw any possibilities for the emergence of new political forms, because basically what you describe is a kind of dialectic. So that we talk about openness here, about content and wanting to make everything available to everybody for a generative, creative, intellectual world, solving problems and so on. There's someone traveling across the country right now also demanding a kind of openness to everything you think and say and communicate and make. And in a sense, he's going to use the same technologies we use to do what he's trying to do. So it seems to me that all of the discussions we've had in this conference, in a sense, represent a projection of what is a much more large-scale struggle that's taking place in the political sector about domination and power and political forms. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that. I realize it's a big question.
It's a big question, but it's an important question. The shortest version of an answer that I can give goes roughly like this. Autonomy in one's individual and social relations, participation in the cultural environment, and making the cultural environment as opposed to simply consuming it, creates certain, not creates, that's too much of a descriptive claim. And what I would like to make is more of a conjecture than an actual descriptive claim that I can prove. It has the potential of making people less passive. It has the potential of making people pay more attention. Because when you go through the world with the feeling that all you can do when you observe something, at most, is complain to a friend, you don't notice quite so much. When what you can do is you can point and say, look what happened, and you're embedded in a network that gives you some likelihood, not 1 in 5 million, like in the mass media environment, let's say 1 in 10, 1 in 20, that it will actually become something that a substantial number of people talk about. You go through the world observing more carefully, taking closer notes, becoming somebody who's more critical of what they see in an effective way, as opposed to ineffective. And so to the extent that you're talking about the development of new cultural forms, the question that comes from this is, are we likely to see the development of more engaged citizens, not only in the sense that they can speak more, but that they're in their habits of day-to-day, observe more closely and understand themselves to be as potential participants in a conversation as they walk around, rather than as people who, at best, educate themselves before an election, and mostly are just in the flow, expecting to be able to go, can you believe that, and nothing more. Needless to say, it's much easier to dominate the latter than the former.
Let's thank Professor Benkler.